In this room, we will be discussing social media recommender systems and how these should be regulated, or the regulation of these systems, how it should be enforced, so that these systems start delivering social and user value. I hate the term user, but I guess we are so stuck with that term that I'm afraid I will be using it sometimes. So how to regulate, how to enforce regulation of these systems so they start delivering value for society and for humans, and not what they are optimized for now, which is user engagement. My name is Katarzyna Szymielewicz. I'm with Panoptykon Foundation for the last 15 years, but also worked with European Digital Rights and People versus Big Tech Coalition, where we created a group of experts working on recommender systems. Some of you are here. Thank you for coming. If others are interested in the fact that there is such a group of experts working together, please come to me and talk to me afterwards. That will be a teaser of our work. I have amazing all-stars panel, but I won't be introducing them now, only when I ask them questions. You won't hear their full bios. You will see them on the screen, and you are invited to read them because they are very impressive. After my short introduction to the topic, I will open discussion with them. We'll have 2 rounds, maybe 3 short rounds of interventions, as Europeans call it, and Americans hate that. But I still use it. So we will intervene, but then we will open for the discussion. So do expect space and time for your comments. Okay, so it's important for me that this thesis that we are making here is understood at the beginning, because this is the premise with which we won't be discussing, really. I'm confident there are other spaces in this conference or last year where we discussed harmful impact of recommender systems. We won't be doing this today, okay? So if you disagree with this premise and you expect us to defend it, it's probably going to be frustrating for you, because we won't do that. We will go further into solutions how to work with them. So the starting point for what we will be discussing here today is that recommender systems are important. They are very important, crucial, as we like to say, design layer of social media. I'm stressing social media because we also won't be discussing all types of large online platforms, like e-commerce platforms where recommenders exist, or Google search where recommender functions. Hopefully it will stay. We won't just change into AI bots. But no, today it's social media, important because they have impact on society in driving conversations, in determining people's access to information, in shaping their worldview. So that's what we are looking at today. And another second, so to say, premise I won't be debating, but I want you to be aware of that, is that there is a growing body of research, like growing for last decade or so it's not very recent even, showing that there is correlation, if not causality, between how these platforms are designed, between various design features of these platforms, and negative effects on society and individuals, like the ones I list here. There will be debate on what is really causing what, and to what extent humans contribute to these negative effects. But we base that panel on the premise that design matters, and what really matters in this design, give me a second. What really matters in this design is the fact that it's designed to exploit attention. It's designed to keep people engaged. So there are many elements of the platform that do that. It's not a simple machine, as you certainly know. So we won't be discussing one specific feature, like notifications or content creation algorithm only. We rather sit on the premise that many design elements together, they bring this problematic situation in which people's attention is exploited and monetized at the cost of their privacy and possibly also other rights. So I'm showing you European Parliament's report on addictive design, which is, for me, setting agenda for hopefully for the next term. We all know in this room that we already have quite powerful regulation of online platforms being Digital Services Act, and we will refer to that, but I'm not showing you this because I know you know it. I'm showing you another chapter, so to say, which is going beyond what we have in the DSA, charting the new territory and making this manipulative design a problem to be regulated beyond what we already have in GDPR, in DSA, and in other laws. So the panel will be discussing the need for this regulation, but not going back to problems, social problems that I just reminded you that we all think they exist and they are quite well documented. So with that, my first question, do we need more regulation in the next term of this area, or maybe we have enough tools to achieve this positive result that I sketched out, goes to Kim van Sparentak, MEP, Greens Group, also candidate for MEP in the new term, who sponsored, if that's the right term, who was behind the addictive design report. Kim, over to you.
Thank you very much. And what an honor that you're quoting my report in your presentation. Yes, so of course, the DSA makes a lot of huge steps. Of course, on transparency, and now we also see that already some investigations have been launched against, recommender systems, against TikTok and Meta, for example. But what we didn't really look at yet is really the consumer protection side of regulation, of legislation, and that we should really have a look also at what's the mental health effects, for example, are of these recommender systems. And that's why we decided to write a report on addictive design and really see, okay, where are the gaps in legislation and where can we make sure that we change certain things. Meanwhile, knowing that the DSA still, is a bit shaky when it comes to really tackling recommender systems that are based on clicks and interaction, which we know that, indeed increase harmful content, increase the spread of, extreme content, and, for example, disinformation. So we really see that we need to do more than that. Right now, we tell them, please try to do everything you can to not spread it. But with the report on addictive design, we go into the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive and in that direction. And in consumer protection, we are way more prescriptive in what we want to see from corporations. So what we want to say is that you're not allowed to do a certain thing, which is not what we do in the DSA. In the DSA, we say, please try to make sure that this doesn't happen, which is more difficult to enforce.
Please assess risk, propose mitigation measures, and we tell you, we the Commission tell you if you got it right. But we can't tell you what to do.
Exactly. And that's why we want to go further and we say, okay, you have to make sure your platform is not addictive. You're not allowed to create algorithms that, make sure that people stay on forever and ever because you never get a signal to your brain that you're actually done with a task because the recommender system just continues. And we want to make sure that certain unfair practices that will just grab your attention continuously are not allowed anymore. And in doing that, it will be a next step on top of the DSA, and we hopefully will be concrete enough in making sure that we can actually have a safer internet and especially a safer social media.
So I have to ask this question, how realistic it is politically that there will be more regulation of that area in the new term? Are there any signals you receive or not receive yet, but expect them to come from the Commission? Like, are they ready for this, you think?
I have heard several things from the European Commission. We know the Commission is quite a, multiple-headed body. So we do hear that, they are doing the digital fairness check. That's also what we, looked at during the writing of the report to really fit into that legislation, into that research. And we also know that the Commission is really looking at whether we should have then a Digital Fairness Act afterwards. But we're also already hearing that the work that has been done really primarily looking at consumer protection is not very popular amongst the people that would like to increase competitiveness. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. So now a second difficult question that has to be asked in this room. What about GDPR? Because some of you might remember we actually have that law that has some principles in it like privacy by design, privacy by default, data minimization, and one would think that if you just apply these principles to something like Facebook, you could not get what you have, which is behavior profiling, quite intrusive by default. And we are getting it. So, yeah, I'm sorry to be asking this question to second grade speaker, Midas Nuvens, Data Protection Authority, Dutch Data Protection Authority, who has the floor.
What an introduction. Yes, we have the GDPR. And yes, you would think that a lot of the behavioral data collection or use of behavioral data would be an issue. I will start by saying that in preparation for this panel, I kind of like asked around at the Dutch DPA, like, okay, what have we done on recommender systems so far? And also what kind of complaints or signals have we received from citizens? And as far as I could tell, which is quite surprising, we haven't received any complaints from people. And also haven't done that much about it ourselves, as far as I can tell, at least not very substantive work. We have done stuff on things that people might call recommender systems when we talk about kind of like fraud detection, algorithms, or automated decision making, right? But we're talking now specifically about social media stuff. So I also think that there's something interesting where it seems like, at least from how people see the role of the DPA, recommender systems isn't one that people come to us to ask about. Maybe other countries, and maybe more in Ireland, where obviously more of the controllers are. So I think that's already an interesting kind of reflection from our role.
Do you have an idea why it might be so? Like they are just assuming that these machines work the way they work, or else?
I think a large part of it is because of how invisible some of these algorithms are, the way that the systems work. That obviously, like, we are in a bubble at the conference here where there's a lot of people who know a lot about the GDPR, you know about your rights, you know what personal data is, these type of things. But I think the general population, at least the Netherlands, definitely still has room to be educated on this topic. So for a lot of people, they don't necessarily see algorithms, right? Or they see in that way. So we get very few kind of like signals from citizens about it. We get a lot of stuff about exercising people's rights and then nothing happening, right? Because I think that's just a lot more visible. And we get a lot of complaints about cookie pop-ups. Those are also very visible. So I think there's part of it just like, what does the population come to us for? And then the other part is also what is actually what can we act on as the Dutch DPA? What are the ones that fall within our sphere of influence? So we have some major platforms like Booking.com, Netflix, Snapchat, but not Meta and not those. So we have the GDPR. You said obviously there's stuff about behavioral profiling that's happening. There's also a lot of just special category data that is probably processed through these, especially since we've seen some recent cases from the CGEU about even inferring something about somebody can be special category data. So there was a civil servant whose partner's name was supposed to be in an open database, and that basically revealed something about their sexual orientation because they were married to a same-sex partner, and they were like, okay, well, this is special category data. So then they said, yes, anything that you can use to infer about other special category data is also special category data. I think most things of what we view on platforms or the activity trails that are generated there are therefore special category data. So you would say, okay, then the most strictest kind of part of the GDPR applies. But it's not very easy to pragmatically actually act on. So one really kind of like almost boring hurdle is just for us to prove that it's special category data. So to get access to these things, right? Because I've also tried, just as a kind of like regular citizen, to do access requests to a lot of these platforms like TikTok. So I had like I think a year-long conversation, try to at least, with TikTok about this. And they kept saying, we don't have any interesting information on you. Here's the list of all the videos that you viewed, but we don't have any categories that we placed you in. So they, in their conception, say that your space and kind of the embedded vectors, right, is not something that you get access to. Or even if you would, even if they would give me a list of just numbers, right, I can't do anything with this. But that is what, as a DPA, we would have to get into if we would have to prove that this is actually special category data. So there's also just like pragmatic difficulties there. Then with the DSA, right, even though, yes, we're the DPA, so we don't say much about the DSA, I can't talk about this regulation.
Okay, we'll let you go without that.
Even with Article 40 access that people can get, right, they'll still run into that problem of just like proving somehow of what exactly is happening with this information. Then other than behavioral data, there's also just the data minimization principle that perhaps we should consider. But I think there also, practically, there are some issues. So in the data minimization principle, it's like, okay, privacy by default, right? Privacy by design, you should be collecting as little data as possible. So a really extreme interpretation perhaps would be then, okay, there should be a recommender system available that doesn't use any personal data, that is a requirement, right? But the issue is that it always says, okay, data minimization for your purpose. So then it kind of opens up the discussion of, okay, well, who decides what that purpose is? Because then if you can just make that purpose narrow enough that it says, well, we want to really show things that we think are super relevant to people based on the things that they've watched before, then you can say, well, then maybe this is the most minimal amount of personal data you can use for that purpose, right? It's also then really difficult to prove somehow that what they're doing is the minimal amount for that. So like, what is the test? There's no kind of like objective measure of that. So that also makes it difficult. One thing I think that there is perhaps the intervention possibility. We've seen with the right to access that a lot of companies interpreted this as we need to have some kind of download button on your platform, right? Which, yes, is not the same thing, but it is something. And I'm wondering if perhaps they can do the same thing for the right to rectification or erasure, where on the platform, right, you can say, well, these are the things that apparently are attached to me. I want to rectify these categories by deleting some of them, that is some kind of like interface element, rather than the way that you do it now. You have to like email them and go through, in my case, a year-long process with TikTok and then end up with nothing, right? But there's another kind of like GDPR angle that through your rights, perhaps they could interpret this through like a user interface intervention.
So this proposition that based on GDPR, behavior profiling by default should not be allowed, would you say yes or no to this question, if you had to?
That it is allowed or that it isn't allowed? I would say that it is allowed as long as you meet a lot of other requirements. There's very little prohibitions in the GDPR, right? So I think it depends on the case, I have to say. Sorry.
Okay. He's in official capacity, that's why. But we go back to this in the break. No, but jokes aside, I do think that if we establish to what extent the behavior profiling is intrusive and it necessarily includes sensitive data, because there's technologically no way of isolating them from behavior profiling, maybe we could get somewhere there, just bringing GDPR. I think maybe it's interesting time to try again. But okay, before we try again GDPR, we have something new. We have the new law in the room to be tested, and that's obviously the Digital Services Act with interesting powers for the European Commission. So I want to ask the question, are these powers sufficient, and can we expect interesting mitigation measures coming from this conversation, which has already started between the Commission and social media platforms? And that question goes to my third distinguished speaker, Kasper Drążewski. BEUC.
Thank you very much. I represent BEUC, umbrella organization bringing together 45 European consumer organizations. We've been active on the digital fairness front for a few years. This is a very good question. It's a question we encounter a lot these days. We have the DSA. What else do we need? And in many ways, it brings added value. Here we're talking about recommenders. We all agree they are a major piece of the puzzle. You could treat them as a magnifying glass of the problems that we are facing when we have made digital technologies a part of our everyday lives. And starting from product recommendations, ending at news, information about the world, we all use recommender systems. And do we do anything about it? These are our sources for news. The younger consumers are, the more certain they are to be actually using recommenders for their news and not any traditional sources. And this means that the views of the world that we see are filtered already by some algorithm. Yes, last year there was a very interesting paper from the University of East Anglia which claimed that ChatGPT has a leftist bias, because the system was asked to simulate left-wing and right-wing discourse in the form of a number of policy points. And then it was asked questions related to that without indicating whether it should be leaning more left or leaning more right. And the researchers found that the responses of ChatGPT were considerably more left than they would have considered the current political center. But what is the current political center? If you look at Twitter, Leave was definitely a winner there. The actual results were different. I will not get into this further. There's a very interesting line of investigation related to the spiral of silence and how people do not feel represented. We're here to talk about recommenders. We have very interesting investigations pending about the transparency measures, about the explainability provisions, the data access provisions. There's a lot of potential for enforcers, definitely for researchers, which is all great, and I can't wait to see the result of these. But on the other hand, what we need here and now is protection for consumers. And earlier in April, you may have heard there was a case about, there was a Politico piece about an American singer who had been promoting drugs on a social media platform, which, as we all know, is a big no-no in Europe. And when asked about, what does the EU digital legislation say about that? We have the DSA, the DMA. Margaret Vestager said, yes, but first people have to complain. Which means this material got millions upon millions of views, and the harm was done until we can actually get up and do something.
Really? What about systemic risks and investigations the Commission can do?
Well, I would have loved to ask the same question, but this is the reality.
Is Margaret Vestager somewhere here now?
So this brings me to my bottom line. We have this beautiful, beautiful tool that is consumer law, which is built to prevent harms before they can occur, to separate manipulation from persuasion, to be technology neutral without limiting ourselves to certain types of platforms, certain types of technologies, high risk, low risk, whatever, horizontally applicable. We just need to make sure it applies, and we need to make sure it is fit for purpose. I'll love to give you more details on that.
So you have given us some details on that in your incredibly rich report. Can I say report, or it has a different stages? Briefing for the European Commission, maybe almost 300 pages. I do recommend that you at least skim through that, because it's a collective work of people whose names you can see up there, some of you in the room. Hi. And you are suggesting that the way I understand this, that there has to be change in principles of the consumer law, because the world has changed to that extent that also consumer law, for internet at least, has to acknowledge that we operate in situation of abuse, of exploitation, of asymmetry of power. That has to be acknowledged. It's not an accident. It's not a bug. It's a feature, right? So if that's a feature of the system in which we operate, we need to have different principles that protect consumers much more effectively. Would you like to introduce this work, or we move on to...
Oh, I would love to, but we have a much better fit speaker here. This is a report that is a result of months upon months of research by an academic team co-led by Natalie. And this is how BEUC works on these work streams. We're trying to get the finest minds to help us figure these things out, and then we prepare our own positions. In this particular case, our position is in the pipeline. We're discussing it with members, but we now have this report out, which is the state of the art of academic research on these topics. Natalie, would you like to?
Yeah, okay, but just one last thing for you, Kasper. Are you advocating for the new regulation then? Are you ready to say that the new commission should work on something called Digital Fairness Act, or it's too early to...
Oh, we've already said that. We've been saying this for a few years. We are now fine-tuning our recommendations. We are absolutely dead certain that the system needs to be updated. It doesn't need to be blown up and built from scratch. That's not the point. We need to make sure it is applicable. So, for instance, we need to look at what is clearly a bankruptcy of the model of protection based on disclosure and consent. Consumers don't read disclosures. They never will read disclosures. And the more complex these systems become, the less of a chance there is that anybody will ever be able to derive anything from there. We have Article 38, we have DSA, we have Article 27 2B on transparency. Has anyone in this room actually analyzed what are the criteria that their recommender systems use so that you could exercise your God-given right, or in this case, Commission-given right, to use a recommender system without profiling? 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
Come on, people. We are data protection. We know.
In this
we are
room, we expect
conscious.
at least 50%. Hands up.
No, this is the problem. We cannot ask consumers. We cannot drop this burden of consumers to become educated about how AI works, how these algorithms work, so that they can make the informed decision of whether or not or how to exercise their rights. This is utopia. As someone famously said, when policymakers do transparency, it means they have no better idea on how to approach something. And personally, I think this continues to apply.
Okay, so you already answered the question I have for Natalie, but Natalie will also have her time to answer it, which is exactly this: how far we can go with tools like transparency and control for users, which, as you reminded us, they exist in the law. They also, to some extent, exist on platforms. What corrective measures we expect? You have many ideas on what I would call corrective measures in your incredible report. So now, over to you, Natalie Helberger, University of Amsterdam, AI, Media and Democracy Lab.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this panel, the good cooperation and the amazing report on addictive design, which is really cool. And now, I think throwing everything on transparency and consumer choice is inherently unfair, and it's actually really cruel. Because if you look into what is happening in digital markets, there are huge, huge asymmetries. Asymmetries in information, asymmetries in power. So going to the consumer and telling him, read what your recommender tells you and make a conscious choice when there is no choice, this is just unethical. So, no, it's not enough. Something that we argued actually is that we should look more into, so at the moment we have very much this idea of the average consumer who's able to perfectly protect herself, equipped with enough information. And one of the arguments we make in the Buick report is actually that we need to think much more about digital vulnerability, and that these systems are, some of these systems, not all, but some of these systems are optimized for making consumers vulnerable and susceptible to persuasion. And there are some consumers, and that's why I also like the addictive design report so much, some consumers are really more susceptible to that or not. Take certain forms of neurodiversity that are completely defenseless against these constant pop-ups that vie for attention. And here I think telling people to read the terms of use and make a conscious choice is...
Set their own time limit?
Set their own time limit is simply, hypocrite. It doesn't work.
So to illustrate some of your points, I took quotes from this incredible report, and I'm showing them now to our audience to show some of the examples of the recommendations you are making. So yes, transparency makes sense, but only if it's interactive, meaningful, and linked to action. But we already know it's not enough. So you say regulators should take expansive reading of Article 27 of the DSA and make it mandatory to offer consumers meaningful choice, through which they can realize their rights to self-determination and self-development. I read that you are saying we need something more than just choice between algorithmic content curation as it stands now, optimized for engagement, and chronological feed or something equally less attractive. There has to be a third way for consumers to exercise their choices, their preferences, make their preferences heard. The difficult part is how to gather, but we are also getting to that part of the conversation. Some other ideas. that I want to show on the screen. You say, you acknowledge that right now these systems are optimized for profit or attention. And I think you are just too realistic to say that that should be forbidden. That's how I read the report. But you say these commercial goals should be subsidiary to functional goals actively chosen by users. So we need to create space in the systems for other values than engagement, which is a commercial goal, a very good one for shareholders, but certainly not good for us humans. How do we do that? If we had 1 more hour, I would go deeply in propositions that we developed in our recommender systems task force. I can only quickly run through them to suggest some of the tools we've been thinking about, how these systems could be redesigned to include more choice, more space for preferences, more what we call positive friction, which is getting people out of compulsive behavior into more conscious choices. But I cannot really discuss them here. I'm just trying to show them for provocation. One of the provocations we developed was these sliders, just to show that these things, they don't have to be incredibly complicated, right? That maybe it wouldn't be ridiculous to expect that these platforms give you sliders where you can have some level of control. It's still AI-driven. It's still letting AI decide what you see, but at least you get to select a different objective, and you can change that objective. On Monday, be more at work. On Tuesday, be more traveling. On Wednesday, be more with kids. I don't know what you like. I mean, our lives are changing, and we should not be just trapped in the same recommender system every time, because we engaged a lot with that one type of content last week, and it keeps haunting us. Or granular feedback option. We know all that they exist. You can give feedback to these platforms, but there is also data, including produced by us. Panoptykon Foundation did case study on that, proving that platforms, they gladly accept it, but they don't really follow negative feedback. It's important signal for them to hear you don't like something, but it does not mean that they will stop showing you that something if it remains engaging. So we would expect them to weight the negative feedback signal in a very different way, make it like overriding principle. If I don't want to see that, it's my hard stop. I'm not saying it, even if that would be a nice thing to monetize. Or this provocation, choose your feed. Wouldn't it be so bad, so complicated, if before even starting to scroll, I would be receiving something like that, where I'm prompted to choose this third way, this feed I tailor according to my preferences, instead of just falling into the default feed profile based on my behavior. We could demand changes like this if we are vocal enough against engagement being the principle. And I think that's exactly the question I want to maybe now ask to the panel, but also slowly open the floor for everybody. Are we ready to say it, that engagement should not be the only principle? And if not, then what? What other values would we expect large platforms, social media platforms, to build in by default? By default meaning you don't have to go and choose it. Because it's a very nice thing to say, let's just give people more choice. And those of them who are more conscious, they will go and get middleware, third-party systems, choose their feeds, curate their feeds. Yes, that will happen for elite of users. But majority of users will remain trapped in this engaging, exploiting, like Casper, exactly like you described. Most of the people, they use recommenders not even realizing they are using recommenders. So what do we do with them? Are we ready to say engagement should not be the overarching principle? So there should be something else. And if something else, then what something else? I open it to anybody in the panel, but maybe Natalie, because you kept your previous intervention short. Maybe you go first.
Sorry, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
For this? Because the examples that you just said, look, we don't want to give people too many options, too much choice, because that doesn't work and that's only for elite users, right? But then the things that you just showed were also more options for people to toggle stuff.
Yeah,
Can you maybe
exactly.
say a little bit, like, how do you see the two as being very different?
I see them as being complementary. It's nice to create these options for those who will use them. I'm not against creating options. I think nobody here would be against creating options and transparency. But my proposition is that we go beyond that and we discuss the default. The default principle in the recommender system being more protective than it is now. So yes, choice is nice, and we could really debate having more personalization, more options for users. But what really strikes me is that as long as the default remains what we have today, most of the people will remain exploited. And I also acknowledge it's a lot of power to change the default, to say what other value should be there. That's why I'm asking this to the panel and to the audience. And I'm prepared that you say, no, we should not exercise this power because it's too much power. So just happy to have your views on that. Natalie.
Yeah, so first of all, Article 27 at the moment is purely transparency. There is no mandatory obligation to give choice, which doesn't make sense because transparency is always a goal to a means to an end. And here the end is helping consumers make conscious choices. So choice should be mandatory. What I really like about your design is that it is actually very consumer-friendly, user-friendly. And our research showed that people really would appreciate having more choice. And then the counter-argument is always, but they don't use it. Exercising choice should be as user-friendly and as intuitive as the service itself. I think that is really, really important. Otherwise, we really can't blame them for not using choice. About the other criteria, an argument that we made in this report, and I see that Michael is here and Laurens Nauts was also here somewhere, my co-authors, is that we also need to talk different about recommender systems on platforms. At the moment, and I really blame, and again, this black box metaphor, because it's really confusing and misleading. It tells us, first of all, there's no way we normal mortal beings can understand or even dare to regulate what is in the cited box, and the box is always someone else. So the social media platform owns the box. So you don't touch other people's boxes. And I think this is inherently wrong because recommender systems on social media are our digital information infrastructure. So it's not only their box, it's also our box, because it's the way we get access to information or not access to information. And we've seen in the whole discussion about shadow banning, for example, how influential that can be. So I think we really need a different mindset when we talk about recommenders. It's not only an algorithm of a platform, it's our digital infrastructure. And once you approach it this way, you start realizing that you really also need to think different about with what kind of values and targets this infrastructure is built. And I think this is super important. The second thing that we do in the report is that we also point out recommender systems are not simply only the algorithm. Again, we have a very limited idea, and that you see also in Article 27, give information about the parameters of the algorithm. Of course, nobody looks into that because, I mean...
I checked that. Google says they have like 2.5 billion parameters, and you can learn a lot by just knowing it.
Yeah. But the recommender system of a platform is a whole stack of different functionalities, and the engine, the model is one of it, but the functionality, the consumer interface, the data that goes into the training data, but also the content that is sourced, and the operational management, the business decisions, are also part of this stack. So I think we really need to be a bit less respectful and keep off the box and look for different intervention points at these different levels of stacks. Part of which could also be simply asking, what do you tell your people to optimize for? And to what extent...
what do you tell your people to optimize for?
Within an organization. So if I'm now, I don't know...
But like, what would be your
one bubble, like, if I'm Zuckerberg and I tell now my recommender people optimize for something, for profit, what is the instruction to the teams building these recommenders, and to what extent, where at this point is something like public interest or public values in the equation? And because recommenders are part of our public information infrastructure, these questions about what we else optimize for need to be had. So it's not only something recommend of a platform, it really concerns all of us. So we have a right to.
Okay, so I'm opening this question to everybody. What other values should be there, take into account, at least, if not replacing engagement? Anybody wants to?
We have a question.
Yeah, okay. We have a mic.
Hello, hi. Sofia Gnadidou from the UK Data Protection Authority, the ICO. So I don't have many opinions around the relevance of the DSA in this conversation. I just wanted to introduce 2 points to this discussion. I don't have an answer in relation to the specific values, but I wanted to introduce the business incentive around taking this approach and not something else. At the end of the day, you have companies that will benefit from exploiting the information they have rather than exploring what's possible, because that's how they monetize it. Engagement leads to monetization of that information. If you tell a system, please take a more exploration approach to your recommender systems, they will tell you, well, that may end up with me having a lower kind of revenue, basically. So one thing, and the second thing I wanted to introduce to this discussion is the question around values. I think it can end up being, even though in principle, I do think it's a really important discussion to have, there's a balance between how we have this discussion and ending up being too paternalistic, if that makes sense. I think when you're talking about the public sphere as a principle, the public sphere is a space where contestation takes place, so a variety of views can be expressed and negotiated. So I would pose that as the first value of creating a space for contestation of different ideas, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Kim, you have the response, and we will pass the mic to gentleman here.
Yeah. Well, maybe also what would be my favorite kind of interface. I think that we don't allow the engagement-based recommender systems based on clicks and interaction anymore in my perfect world. And every time you log into your social media, you can just say what you are there for. I would love that. If I'm sad and I just want to see things that make me happy, that you can have that. If I go for work, I get a lot of political things because that's what I do for work. Something like that. So yeah, more choice, that would be nice. When it comes on what kind of responsibilities these kind of platforms and the makers of those recommender systems have, for me, they are almost like a sort of public infrastructure, because almost all our public debate is now happening online. And if you are able to play the algorithm, you are in the talk show in that same evening, or in the newspaper the next day. So I think we should really make sure that when we're talking about these social media algorithms, we take that into account, the enormous impact they have on our society, the enormous impact they have on our public debate, and thus on our democracies. And that's why I think we can be very strict, and that's why values such as privacy, democracy should be at the core of how these systems are made, because otherwise our public debate is based on what makes a few tech boys the most profit, and I think that's not something we should want.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that absolutely we are aware that it will cost money. Nobody is, I think, saying anything else, right? We hope that I hope in Europe we go to the point where we can say it. Yes, it will mean less profit, but hey, that's exactly what we want to achieve with this regulation. Less profit, more social accountability. Sir?
Yes, Joe Pearson from School of Social Sciences, Hasselt University. First, I want to make a point. It's a lot being talked about consumer protection. Well, it's a pity. It's about citizens, and a consumer is something else than a citizen. Citizen has other kind of expectations. Probably is something others that we would look upon. But of course, if we can use consumer protection for protecting citizens, that's a win. But if I pick up on the question which is there on the slide, so this how to translate these value-based objectives, I think it's quite generic in a sense. When you would have to translate values, I would say public values or public interest values in this case, because you say it's the opposite of commercial values. I think you need to look at different levels. You need to, first of all, look at, of course, at the stakes in the grounds, the fundamental values, human rights, privacy, freedom of expression, democracy, all things we hold dear in a liberal democracy. That's the first start. I think a second level is look at the sector where you're talking about. If you talk about systems, recommender systems, or other smart systems in education, for example, we're doing a lot of research in education and learning management systems. There you talk about some more specific values, teacher autonomy, accessibility for pupils. So there are other things that are also important and that might be needed to be more specific than only these generic things, which might not give sufficient amount of guidance to developers to build into the systems and to make them more like oriented towards public values. And third level, I would say, is then what about the users themselves, how they are involved, what kind of say do they have? Is there some kind of participatory trajectory to involve them, possibly represented by civil society or not? So how to involve them also in this process? And I think these three levels are quite essential, not to being too generic, but also taking into account how citizens feel and taking into account the context. Contextual integrity and all this stuff is very essential in this regard, I would say.
Thank you for your comment. Maybe gentleman next.
Wow, there's so much to comment about. I want to start from the last point that you mentioned. I think it's actually excellent to bring the conversation about the consumer protection. We often talk about the users, the citizens, but by doing that, sometimes we forget that the context is within the digital service providers and the consumers, right? Like, I mean, you use the search engine or you access Facebook, and in that situation, you are a consumer in the first place. The issues that come as a citizen and etc. That's of course it's there, but in the first place, you're a consumer. And I think the consumers are facing the issue that the citizens were facing during Enlightenment, when the workers were facing, in the time of the Industrial Revolution. Now it's the consumers that are facing it in that context of them being consumers, because they're exploited in that context. And I just want to actually not say anything new, but just continue what the lady in front started. She said two things: incentives, and then be careful with values. And first of all, I think we forget that Commission's job, and I think the enforcer's job, is not to innovate, is to correct the incentives so that the innovators invent things that are beneficial to us. I think the first thing that we need to resolve is that the enforcer corrects the incentives. And then the second thing, and I think we are on that track, and it's going on. And the second thing is, I think what you demonstrate, the value is autonomy. I think people should be able to decide on their own values. And I think, Katarzyna, what you showed us, the choice and the user options, this is exactly what it does. People have to be able to develop their own capabilities, what they think suits their life interest, and etc. And the question that I also wanted to ask, in my personal research that I found through all the ways that we regulate these things or we deal with these things, most useful is not the consumer transparency, it's not the prohibitions, but in effect, it's the risk mitigation. It was a bit of like a cynicism I noticed about risk mitigation, but actually these parts were what worked. Like if you look at the Meta Bundeskartellamt case, it's the risk mitigation that the court used. It didn't say that it was wrong, the balancing interest is actually flawed and you violate. It said that you, Meta, didn't conduct the risk assessment. You said that only risk for the consumer of behavioral advertising is nothing. It's actually beneficial for their fundamental rights, which doesn't make sense, therefore I fine you. So I think I personally find that through that way, through using DSA that way, we can actually correct the incentives that way. And my question was to you, if you could just reflect on that and see if this is correct.
Okay, let's get one more comment on the back, Fernando, or looking also at Jeff. Maybe you want to comment later from the perspective of somebody who knows the design.
Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you, Kasia, for the provocations. But I just have two specific questions to keep the conversation going where it was. First, does it have to mean less profit, or can it mean that other people and other organizations make the profit if we think about recommender system interoperability? We have in many sectors in the European economy understood that we cannot have vertical integration, among other things, for the competition effects. and how consumers are harmed from that, should we open up recommender system to third parties to actually be able to have many of the different things that are shown here? And the second point, should we actually be expecting more from the DSA? I understand the contraposition of the DSA as don't do versus traditional consumer law as do, but we have a very open and a very wide notion of what risks must be mitigated, any actual or foreseeable risk in so many different areas, including all fundamental rights, including physical and mental well-being of children, public safety, etc., etc. And in the list of mitigation measures, the fourth element that is listed is not only adapting, but adapting and testing the recommender systems. So far, everything we have seen is investigations related to specific impacts of recommender systems on children. Should we be, even if we probably need to go beyond the DSA, should we still be expecting more from the DSA?
Thank you. Jeff, if you want to comment also on that question, and we go back to the panel, and then we will reopen a second round of comments. So we will be back to comments after this short round.
Sure. Yeah. On the question of sort of like alternative values, and also on the profit question, right? I think there are examples today of big platforms that are using actually other values to rank things, and I think the point of the platform that I always go to is sort of like the alternative to engagement-based ranking is actually Google Search. And like Google Search's mission is to make the world's information widely available and useful. And so they actually figured out like what is useful content, what is not useful content. And they actually wrote out 60 pages that define in detail how do you separate out highly useful content from somewhat useful content to not useful content. And then they called this their search quality rater guidelines. And so Google, like the biggest ranking signal in Google is they're predicting if it's useful content or not, and then they call that quality. That's their definition of quality. And Google is a $1 trillion corporation, right? Like it can be very, very profitable to rank content by other things than user engagement. And as someone who has worked on both search engines and on social media ranking systems, under the hood they're very, very similar, right? Like there is like a little bit difference in terms of like how users use them and the intent they bring to it. But under the hood they look very, very similar.
Thank you. Okay, I'm back to my panel to give you a chance to comment on what you heard. Yeah, Midas, you go first.
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on the questions of the enforcer should change the incentives, since I am here as the enforcer. And I want to preface what I'm going to say now with, I don't agree that the current situation that we're in is good, but often it's the role of the DPA to say all the things that you can't do or that we're concerned about if you want to go in that direction. So in that sense, I think when we're talking about different values or different metrics that we want to use, and especially then we use words like public values, right? And often I think those will go into directions of, oh, so we should know more about, is this something that perhaps women or minorities are more interested in? Do we want to have pluralism of kind of political content? And so obviously if you want to have metrics on that and you want to know what somebody's interested in, then you also have to collect more special category data of that person. And so we're getting into the same thing of like, okay, we need to collect, very sensitive data to detect bias, or, the same stuff that we have now in the AI Act, and we might go into that direction as well. I think that as a DPA, more data collection is always something that we're concerned about. And especially then when you couple that to some of the other suggestions of, oh, we should open up these platforms so that, third parties or other people can then also engage in this and perhaps have alternative recommender systems. I don't want to end up in a situation that we have now with real-time bidding, for example, where some personal data is passed on to 400 different parties who can then decide who's going to offer something to somebody. I'm not saying that we shouldn't look for alternatives, but those are just kind of like the two concerns that I would have with this. So if we're saying, okay, the regulator should look at the incentives, then I also don't want to create incentives that just stimulates more data valence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kasper.
On the
maybe Kasper go first.
I think you raise your hand first. Let's go. Then I can.
On the systemic risk provisions, I do think that they could be interesting. First challenge is where to get started. There's so many systemic risks that you're a bit like the cobra, the mouse and the cobra. But I think we have from research a lot of evidence about potential diversity, systemic risk, for example, for diversity in the public sphere and media pluralism and exposure to different voices. So there's something that we could get started with. The question is who is assessing the systemic risk. If we ask platforms to do that, then probably the risk assessment will look really, really different than if you ask a research institution or a media regulator. And at the moment, how the DSA is structured, it seems like the first go is with the platforms. But then we get in this situation where we have a situation where a platform says, no risk, and then someone else has to say, yes, risk. So I think we need to establish more accountability and outside expertise to monitor and legitimacy of these outside expertise, like researchers, to identify systemic risks. I think that is important. Talking about incentives, I also want to say that there are some organizations that are really trying very hard to develop alternative metrics. So with the AI Media Democracy Lab, we work with a lot of media organizations that try to build recommenders that optimize for more diversity, less bias, more inclusion of marginalized voices, and so far. So I think this is also something to think about too. Sometimes you can manage the systemic risk not only by tackling platforms, but also helping other parties and creating counterpower. For example, encouraging innovation projects like these in organizations that have actually expertise in sorting information.
Thank you. I'm suggesting some solutions on the screen while you speak, because we thought about similar ones, and with the media producing quality, diverse, trustworthy content, it's all great to have them, but we also need to make them visible, right? So there are two elements of that, production and distribution. Of course, they are interconnected. When there is problem with distribution, people stop doing production because there is no money in producing content that does not get seen, right? So we need to take care of both angles. But yeah, definitely diversity could be one of these metrics to be included in recommender systems. Kasper and Kim.
There are many very important points have been raised. I will try to react to at least some of them. On the consumer citizen front, I could not agree more. We are, well, the low-hanging fruit would be to put on my JFK hat and say we're all consumers, but the fact of the matter is we often do not realize that we are in a transaction. And we are not always paying with our money. We don't have it written in the law anywhere that this is also a transaction when you're paying with your attention. We have the new guidance from the European Commission on the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive that says exactly that if you're making choices like clicking on content, scrolling through a newsfeed, these are also transactions, and it makes all kinds of sense to start looking at it that way. We talk about should we ban engagement-based optimization, but we haven't even decided. We haven't even maximized the options we have to decide how this engagement is being used, how it's being created. If we switch from surveillance advertising to contextual, we're also monetizing engagement, but we're doing so in a much less harmful way. I think it was last month, there was a very interesting ruling in Italy against TikTok, which analyzed the business model, showing how engagement translates into direct income for the company, and also showing that the company does not shy away from extracting this monetization, does not shy away from creating addictive effects, especially harmful for children, simply to maximize this monetization. This is how this money is being made. And if we are serious about treating this as a transaction, and we should be, we should ask ourselves the question, why are we not protecting these people the same way we would be protecting them if they were buying things with money? And here the harms are far greater. We're talking about mental health. We're talking about the quality of life of future generations. We will only see 20, 30 years from now the effect of the world that we have created for our kids. And it's time to start asking these questions. This brings me to the point that is the bottom line of our requests under digital fairness. We're asking for fairness by design and by default. As a consumer, you have the right to expect you will be treated fairly. It sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but try that with some stakeholders.
That's radical.
You have the right to expect that you will not have to get a PhD on data processing or algorithmic optimization in order to be able to feel safe on a service. You have the right to expect that you will be getting what you're promised. If you're promised an individualized service, a personalized service, it will respect that it is your wishes, your expectations, instead of making it a machine to extract your attention and keep you clicking, keep you scrolling. It means we are asking for a positive obligation under how we understand professional diligence in the digital era, and we have to be. I couldn't agree more. We have to be more bold in formulating these requests, because we're no longer talking about a situation where a consumer was entering a store and the worst thing that could happen was they would get a wrong pair of shoes. We're talking about the world's democracies standing on the brink of a change that we may not like at all. And this is because we haven't been paying attention. So the question is now, where do we take it from there? We say, we have the right to ask for the digital world, for services to be fair by design, by default, and the more control a trader has over an environment, and let's be honest, we're no longer talking about selling shoes, we're talking about controlling the way information is presented to us, the way choices are presented to us, the way our choices are being steered. 97% of major retail e-commerce outlets were found to be deploying dark patterns in the Commission behavioral study. The behavioral science is there, but it should be on those entities to be putting it in order to protect autonomy, to protect choice, rather than trying to get away with undermining it.
Kim.
Yes. No, I'll keep it brief because I think a lot of things have been said. I mean, I think the DSA offers us a lot of opportunities to make sure that we can do a lot of things, and I call upon all of you, use it as much as you can, as the best way you can, because that's also the sooner we will know the flaws, and we'll make sure that we can put forward other legislation or update the DSA. But when it comes, for example, to disinformation, I really think we the code of conduct on disinformation is not going to cut it. And that's where I'm really, really concerned, and really, just asking these big platforms nicely to not spread disinformation is not going to cut it. And that, like when we're talking about incentives, creating a platform that doesn't help the Russians into spreading disinformation all over the place, I would hope that could be an incentive, but maybe that's too much to ask.
Let's hear from our audience about incentives, about the values you would like to see written in these machines, sir.
Hi, I'm Jeris Panakis from Maastricht University. Thank you for your points so far. I'd like to make maybe a next question after the values. Let's say we find these perfect values, diversity, trustworthiness. I have buttons that allow me to see more cuts, I don't know, whatever people want to see, right? But then I think you mentioned it, that even if there are these buttons that show me less of this, they're not really implemented. So even if we have these perfect values, how are we going to enforce and monitor the compliance and do it in a proactive way? Because I think that's the big problem in the end, that self-transparency and self-regulation doesn't work, right? Also talking about the DSA, it comes with a database, which is called Transparency Database. We did analyze this, we have a paper on this, but it's just a huge pile of data which is sitting there because exactly the platforms were allowed to self-report on this, right? So I'm curious about your thoughts, right? How are we going to proactively monitor? Because exactly waiting people to complain is also like a bit of the wrong direction. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One more comment, and I see one. How many comments we have? Let's check. Okay, 2 there. So let's take the 4.
Very quick comment. I don't want to take time from others, but I just wanted to comment on Midas. I think you misunderstood. I was when I said incentives and enforcers, it was not the DPAs that I was talking about. It's about the market for me and the Commission as the enforcer of the competition law and the DSA and the DMA, because I think it's about the, I think it's about the money and whoever corrects the incentives in the market, and definitely not the DPA's job to do that.
No, but I think the DPA should also contribute to this, no?
For sure, but
I think
you
it's
guys
everybody's
do,
problem.
but it's
Yeah,
not.
why not?
Like,
Why not?
It's not your main task, I would say. It's somewhere else.
But
That was just
if
a
we can
comment
help,
that I would make.
we'd be happy to.
Okay, Magda, in the white.
So hello, my name is Magda. I work for an e-commerce company, so the kind of company that at the beginning was put outside of the panel. But I just wanted to add to this discussion about values and maybe complicate it a bit, because I'm wondering from a perspective of e-commerce platform, but I'm pretty sure the same applies for social media. If we talk about values, platforms are often between two types of values, because if you have two-sided platform, then you can have values for, on the one side, merchant, and on the other hand, of consumer. And these values differ, because for merchant, the value is to sell, and sometimes even at the cost of selling counterfeited goods or not safe goods. For consumer is, I think, those values that you mainly focus to get safe products or content, to get the codec. So I think there's one more super interesting aspect, how to balance the values when you have two-sided platform with different values at stake, right? And the platform ends up as a arbitrator that we believe we don't want platforms to be, but I'm not sure platforms want to be them as well. So maybe timing is not good to add such a question, but maybe you could share your thoughts on how to answer diverging values on the platform.
Sorry, can I just ask a question of clarification? So are you saying that like your business consumers, like their value is into making sure they sell good even though it's counterfeited goods? Like,
No. What
really
I'm saying is that on the platform, if you have two different, let's say, types of users, right?
Yes,
you
but are you saying that you are actually listening to like the values of these companies that want to sell counterfeited goods?
No. I'm saying that from a platform perspective, of course, majority of sellers want to sell proper goods, etc. But you need to factor in the fact that you will have to protect consumers against counterfeited and unsafe product, etc. So what I mean, if we're talking about algorithmic selections, you need to tweak the algorithm in a different manner, right? So I'm just adding to the point that these values could be different, right? For what the users want. I'm not saying that these, maybe you ask values, I'm saying objectives more, right? But not saying that that's the value that should be supported. But I'm just raising that there can be two types of, or maybe multiple types of values at stake.
Okay, we have one more comment on the back. Let's take it, and we will are back to the panel, and that's probably going to be our closing round.
Thank you very much for the discussion and the exchange of views. I work for the European Data Protection Supervisor, and sometimes we have a bit of difficulty putting the emphasis on the human dignity, because it's true that we are talking about the consumer rights, data protection and data subjects' rights, but how to pinpoint this issue that is absolutely transversal of having human dignity, and instead of forcing people into this vicious of scrolling and this addiction that is definitely by default set up by these big platforms, shouldn't we also tackle that? Because that goes beyond the problem with this huge data platforms, is that we have the same issue with different angles, and we never take an holistic approach. And so on the side of data protection, we take what we can. On the side of consumer law, I'm sure that the tools that are being used are also in that regard. But to really tackle an absolutely transversal drama, how can we somehow have a more efficient and effective action? Thank you.
Efficient and effective action on enforcement side.
On enforcement as well.
Okay, so thank you for your comments. I regret we only had 1 hour and 50 minutes. Maybe we can use some of the break or follow up later, but that will be the last 5 minutes for the panel to speak. I only want to address the enforcement element because, you know, we all assume here that the Commission has these powers. I mean, it has them on the paper, right? Whether it will use these powers or not, it's another thing. But it's not, because maybe we were misunderstood at some point. It's not like the Commission needs to wait for complaints, okay? It can do investigation. It's doing investigations. There are investigations even against Meta and TikTok already, and Twitter. Some of them touched on the problems we are discussing. So this is happening. It's too early to assess how effective that will be, but there are incredibly high fines, even suspension of services now being exercised towards TikTok. So it's not like there is no enforcement, just trying to clarify that, and maybe we talk about values being the more tricky part of the conversation. Over to you. Who wants to go first? Okay, Natalie. Okay, Kim, you go first. And
yeah, no. So just you know, how are we going to tackle it? In my addictive design report, I basically said the default of every social media app, or every app actually, and also every digital product such as smartphones, should be the non-addictive one. I know that sounds logical, but of course it is the world upside down compared to what it is right now. So I would say that should be the standard, and that should be the goal of where we are heading to. I'm not sure if we're going to do that right in one turn, because we also know the forces we're up against, but that would be how I would see it.
Thanks for bringing up the value conflict. Yes, there's a need to balance different values, and that is exactly what we argue for. At the moment, a lot of the very large commercial recommended systems are optimized for the value of the platform, commercial value. And actually, as part of the project, we coined a new right to constructive optimization. And essentially, what this right includes is exactly that providers of recommender systems should not only take into account their own commercial interests, but also take into account the legitimate interests of users, including non-users, marginalized groups, in the protection, realization of their rights, right to dignity, but also privacy and freedom of expression. So doing exactly this balancing exercise.
So we go back to how to do it next year. Casper.
I'll be super brief. I don't like pitting values of consumers and traders against each other. They're not inherently contradictory. We talk a lot with organizations bringing together smaller businesses in Europe. A lot of these people just want to make a living, and what a majority of them want is roughly the same thing as what the majority of consumers want, which is to live in a fair and safe world. Yes, I agree that there is a risk where we're talking about. Okay, I will not get into that. Very quickly, when the platform acts as an intermediary, when it does 90% of the legwork for a transaction, maybe we should be asking what responsibilities it should have. Maybe its professional diligence should be to make sure that the transaction is actually being fair and safe, and this is how you get good practices, and this is how you get a fair market where the honest actors prevail and the others, well, do not.
Midas, you get the last word.
I think I want to pick up on that last question on the difficulty of putting human dignity kind of like at the center of conversations. Very pragmatically, at the Dutch DPA, we've just gone through a whole kind of like strategic discussion internally about should we be more value-centric. Everybody's agreed. We've picked some values that we put at the center, and we're now trying to figure out how to actually operationalize this, because currently what we struggle with is that we can do those things in press releases. We can say, like, we really care about these type of things and we really think people should be acting more like this, but it's really hard to bring those into actual investigations or court cases. So we're just still trying to figure out, okay, what do we do with those values other than just slapping it on a document and patting ourselves on the back for being value-centric? Like, how can you actually operationalize those? Hopefully next year I will have an answer.
Thank you. I just realized that I put the wrong title. It's Safe by Default, not by Design, but there is a report that if you want to read more about the ideas of the group I chaired, the People vs. Big Coalition, on recommender systems, we have quite, not fat, but it's not big, but it's rich report explaining some of the ideas of Safe by Default. Panoptykon.org, Safe by Default takes you there, and there is, of course, the report we've been discussing, commissioned by Vogue, co-authored by Natalie, Michael, others, on consumer fairness. So have a good reading and see you next year.